Chapter 1. The Widow's Alehouse Late. October fog clung to the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple stepped from her coach onto the uneven cobbles of the village square. She paused to draw her shawl more tightly about her shoulders, noting how the tendrils of mist curled around the lampposts and drifted into the low-arched doorways. A bitter wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the old linden trees, carrying the distant clatter of tankards and laughter from the widow Hawkins's alehouse at the square's far corner. Miss Marple's visit to the alehouse that morning was prompted by an unexpected letter. Its handwriting, precisely looped yet trembling, belonged unmistakably to Mrs. Lucy Hawkins, the village's sole brewer and proprietor of the dimly lit taproom which she had inherited upon her husband's death 2 years earlier. The letter had arrived by hand, sealed with a smear of purple wax bearing Mrs. Hawkins's initials, and bore a short plea. Dear Miss Marple, I beg your presence this morning at the alehouse. Something has gone dreadfully wrong, and I know not whom else to trust. Now, as she approached the heavy oak door, Miss Marple took in the crooked sign above, a worn copper plaque on which a stout woman held aloft a frothing flagon, and the low, golden light spilling from the windows. Inside, the brass bells tinkled softly, and she heard the low murmur of voices. Farmers discussing the barley harvest, a pair of grooms trading jokes, and the familiar voice of Mrs. Hawkins herself, quavering behind the bar, pushing open the door. Miss Marple stepped into a swirl of smoke, heat, and the comforting aroma of malt and yeast. The taproom was narrower than she remembered, its flagstone floor worn smooth by years of eager patrons and lined with rough-hewn benches. Against the far wall stood the broad bar, an expanse of dark oak streaked with scratches and burnished by countless hands. Behind it, casks of various sizes were stacked on their bunks, and a stout brass tap jutted from the wall. Its spigot stained from years of use. Mrs. Hawkins stood behind the bar, her apron stained as though she had been scrubbing. Relentlessly, her fair hair disheveled at the nape of her neck, she spotted Miss Marple and hurried forward, her eyes wide with relief. Miss Marple, she exclaimed, pressing a gloved hand to her cheek. Thank goodness you came. I don't know what to do. Miss Marple offered her a steadying smile. Good morning, Lucy. Thank you for your letter. Please tell me what has happened. Mrs. Hawkins led her to a small table in the corner, where a solitary half-pint glass stood untouched, a bead of moisture trickling down its side. She sank into the wooden chair, clasped her hands together, and drew a shuddering breath. It began yesterday afternoon, she said, her voice quavering. A most peculiar thing occurred during the last delivery of the ale. I had filled 6 barrels standard porter, smooth and dark, all inspected and sealed, each cask marked with my own initials. But when my delivery boy, young Samuel, went to tap one cask this morning, he discovered empty. She shuddered again. Completely dry, yet the seal was intact. Miss Marple cocked her head. Samuel uses the proper key for your barrel locks? Yes, of course. I showed him myself. He tapped away and nothing. Not a drop of porter. He thought the cask might have a crack, but on inspection it was as sound as ever. No leakage, no cracks, just empty. Miss Marple tapped her lips thoughtfully. And what of the other barrels? 3. More were surprisingly light when we tried them. The remaining 2 were full. Mrs. Hawkins ran a shaking hand through her curls. I've never heard of anything like it. Who would steal only part of one barrel, or worse, glimpse a sealed cask and remove its contents without breaking the seal? And why? Were these barrels kept in the same room overnight? Miss Marple asked gently. They were stored in the cool store beside the brewer's room, locked and alarmed. I arrived early to check them myself. Mrs. Hawkins dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. No forced entry either to the brewery or the store. Miss Marple glanced around the alehouse. The walls were bare, except for a wooden rack holding Samuel's shovel and a few brewing tools. To her left, a narrow staircase led down to the cellars, where the casks rested on their bunks. She rose and motioned Mrs. Hawkins to follow. They descended into the cool, stone-arched cellar, damp and dim, lit by a single gas lamp that flickered in the slight draught. Rows of barrels stood in neat lines on wooden supports. The air smelled of oak and fermenting yeast. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail, the placement of the barrels, the uniformity of their rings, the path Sam had trodden from the staircase to each cask. "Show me the empty barrel," she said. Stepping forward, Mrs. Hawkins indicated one in particular, ringed with iron hoops. "That one," she whispered. "Number 5. It bore my initials L.H., painted in white. The seal is right here." She pointed to a small padlock and wax seal wrapped around the bung dot. Miss Marple examined the seal closely. It was unbroken and bore the purple mark of Mrs. Hawkins's signet. She tapped it lightly with her fingernail. "Curious," she murmured. She knelt and circled the barrel, and the wood shows no sign of tampering. The brewer's boy, Samuel, who had followed, timidly stood at the foot of the stairs. His brown face was pale, and his straw-colored hair stuck out in tousled tufts. "Samuel, did you see anyone in the cellar yesterday?" Miss Marple asked. He swallowed. "No, ma'am. I locked up after loading Mistress Hawkins's orders and left. When I came back early this morning, Mr. Barnes, our landlord, was here, fiddling with the tap on barrel 6. I chased him off, as Mistress Hawkins told me it was closed." Miss Marple straightened. "Mr. Barnes? The landlord of the Crown Inn?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He said the alehouse was closed, and he was checking supplies. But Mistress Hawkins told me to ask why he's here." Miss Marple paused beneath the lamp's glow. "And his barrel?" "It was full," said Samuel. "He only tapped number 6, then hurried back upstairs when he saw me." Above them, the footfall of a heavy boot sounded on the stone steps. Mr. Barnes's face appeared, grim and flushed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, voice curt. "I came to apologize for the scare I gave Samuel. I found one of my own kegs nearly empty and feared someone had mixed up the seals." Miss Marple regarded him coolly. "Your keg belongs to the Crown Inn, Mr. Barnes. Why would one of yours be in Mrs. Hawkins's cellar?" He swallowed and wiped his brow. "A misunderstanding, I'm sure. I thought, well, we've been low on porter lately. Thought to replenish. I mean no harm." Miss Marple smiled gently but firmly. "Mr. Barnes, you risked breaking Mrs. Hawkins's seal, and perhaps compounded her losses. These empty barrels were sealed correctly, and the theft must have occurred prior to this morning's tapping. You were here after the incident was discovered, not before." Barnes flushed deeper. "Very well, Miss Marple. I meant no trouble. I'll take my leave." He turned and clattered back up the stairs, his echoing footsteps receding. Miss Marple stood silently, then beckoned Samuel forward. "Tell me again the order in which you found the barrels," she said. Samuel pointed. 1 and 2 were full. 3 was slightly lighter, but still had some ale. 4 and 5 were nearly empty, just a few mouthfuls. 6 was full. Miss Marple nodded, tracing the line of barrels. "And you tapped them in numerical order?" Samuel bent his head. "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to check the oldest stocks first." Miss Marple surveyed the scene thoughtfully. "Then someone removed ale selectively, not all at once. Perhaps 2. Leave no sign of a sudden disappearance. And they knew precisely which barrels to target." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Samuel, show me where the ale is tapped out and where the waste drains." He led her to a corner where a shallow trough, carved into the stone floor, drained into the sewer. Discoloration stained the channel in irregular patches, as though liquid had trickled here and there. Miss Marple stooped, touching a few damp spots. "What is that?" she murmured, drawing her hand back with a slight sniff. "That's not ale. It's water mixed with something heavier, like porter, but thinner." Samuel wrinkled his nose. "I saw water in the drain once after cleaning, but not here." Miss Marple stood and turned to Mrs. Hawkins, who had lingered at the stairhead. "Lucy, did you notice whether the thief used the cellar's cleaning hose or some other water source?" Mrs. Hawkins frowned. "We have a hose connected to the pump. Only I used it yesterday to wash down the floor, but I drained it before I left." Miss Marple tapped her chin. "Someone could have run water into the empty barrels to disguise. The theft then drained it through this channel. That would explain the seal's intactness and the damp patches here." Samuel nodded eagerly. "Mr. Fletcher, the gardener, fills the watering cans at that tap each morning. He was here late yesterday afternoon, fetching water." Mrs. Hawkins gasped. "George Fletcher? He's been nothing but dutiful." Miss Marple's eyes were bright. "Appearances can deceive. Let us see if Mr. Fletcher can explain why he was in the cellar after hours." She turned back to the steps. "Samuel, please fetch Mr. Fletcher, and send Mrs. Hawkins's apprentice to keep the customers occupied. We have questions to ask." As Samuel bolted upstairs, Mrs. Hawkins clutched her hands. "Jane, if George is involved, I shall be heartbroken. He's been like a son to me." Miss Marple laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Fear not, Lucy. We shall uncover the truth, and I hope find that George's conscience is as pure as ever." And so, beneath the flickering lamplight of the widow's alehouse, I thought no more of it. Miss Marple stood, brushing flourishes of dust from her skirt. "Let's not leap to conclusions. There are 3 who could have access. Mr. Barnes, who visits early, Mrs. Marsh, who often calls for jugs, and Samuel, who tends the casks. We must examine each possibility." They climbed back to the taproom, where Miss Marple asked Mrs. Hawkins for a fresh tankard of No. 6, still known to be untainted. Sipping it and tasting its familiar malt sweetness, Miss Marple nodded. "The contamination is localized to barrel 7. Now, Mrs. Hawkins, did you or your assistant add any cleaning agents or rinsing solutions to 7's bunghole before sealing?" Mrs. Hawkins shook her head emphatically. "Never. We clean the casks with warm water and a mild lye wash, then rinse thoroughly. Barrel 7 was washed last Thursday and sealed on Friday, like the others. Miss Marple turned too. Samuel, and you, dear, did you notice any spills, bottles, or jugs left near Seven's bung? Samuel's shoulders drooped. I did see a broken vial on the floor yesterday when I pumped water. Thought it was from the cooper's tool kit, but I cleaned it up. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. What vial? He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and smoothed it out. A single word, acidum, scrawled in elegant handwriting above a smudge of red wax. I found this near the drain. Miss Marple pressed a finger to the paper. Latin for acid. Someone brought an acid here and didn't want you to know. She studied Mrs. Hawkins. Acid would sour ale swiftly. Now, who keeps acids? In St. Mary Mead, George frowned. Dr. Hayward, the apothecary. He has bottles behind his counter. Mrs. Hawkins paled. I saw Dr. Hayward yesterday afternoon, buying tinctures something for a horse's hooves. Miss Marple cocked her head. Indeed. An apothecary sells acetic acid for salves. Dr. Hayward would have motive only if he harbored ill will unlikely. But we know that water was pumped into Seven's barrel yesterday. Could the saboteur have run acetic acid in instead of water, to hide the theft as cleaning? Samuel's eyes widened. They would need a vessel to carry the acid. A flask. Or vial, Miss Marple nodded. Now Mrs. Marsh regularly borrows jugs. Could she have borrowed a flask instead? She turned to George. Fletcher, fetch the hidden flask from near the barrel. George hesitated, then returned with a slender glass vial, its cork still damp, stained at the neck with rust-colored residue. Miss Marple held it to the light. The glass rippled with ridges, as though designed to diffuse liquid slowly. On its side the letters E.M. had been etched. E.M., Miss Marple murmured. Certainly not Dr. Hayward's style. Mrs. Marsh's initials, also Ellen Marsh. Could she have returned after her water misadventure to cover her tracks by introducing acid when she saw a rival's barrel nearing sale? Mrs. Hawkins drew a sharp breath. I didn't charge her for barrel 7. She only requested number 4's ale. Samuel touched her arm. Sam? Mrs. Marsh's name seemed to echo in the rafters. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, collecting her thoughts. Or someone borrowed her flask to frame her. She studied the vial. This glassware is common in chemists, but the etching seems freshly done. Our culprit likely etched the initials to mislead. She returned the vial to Samuel. Now, then, we have acid introduced deliberately after cleaning and before sale. Who could have done this with access to the cellar and to flask marking? Mr. Barnes arrives at 8 too late. Mrs. Marsh arrives at 3:30. But did she return after closing? Or did someone borrow her flask and leave the note to divert suspicion? Lucy's hand flew to her throat. This is becoming a tangled web. Miss Marple set her face in kindly determination. We must observe tonight. At closing time I will conceal myself in the brewer's loft and watch who passes between the taproom and the cellar. Bring all suspects under the lanterns. Light and the true saboteur will reveal themselves either by action or reaction. That evening, as lanterns glowed and patrons lingered over pints, Miss Marple slipped upstairs to the loft, a narrow space where malt sacks lay stacked, and a small hatch opened onto a vantage above the cellar stairs. From here she could see every foot and hear every whisper. Mrs. Hawkins and Samuel lock the taproom at 8. Moments later, George hurried downstairs to fill the flower vases an innocent chore. Miss Marple watched him tap lightly at 7's bung, then slide aside, placing a slender flask to the hole and tipping in a few drops before resealing and carefully imprinting a fresh wax seal. Miss Marple caught her breath. It was George Fletcher, the trusted apprentice, seeking to destroy the spring batch so that the widow's alehouse's reputation would falter, leaving custom to the Crown Inn. His motive was clear: to avenge his earlier shame as suspected accomplice in the Cooper's theft, and to regain favor at Barnes's establishment. As George slipped away, Miss Marple descended and confronted him in the cellar's shadow. "George," she said softly, "I saw you." He spun, flask in hand, eyes wild. "Miss Marple, I meant no further harm, only to protect my position here. Once Mrs. Hawkins knew it was me, I would be dismissed." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but firm. "You have endangered a beloved village institution. You will confess to Mrs. Hawkins at once." George's shoulders sagged. He crumpled, tears shining. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I failed you again." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Fear not, Mrs. Hawkins cares for you still, but you must face the consequences." By dawn, the village knew of George's second betrayal. Yet Mrs. Hawkins, with Miss Marple's counsel, chose mercy. George would undertake daily apprenticeships under a new brewer in Tunbridge, and if he proved worthy, return to St. Mary Mead in spring. The spring ale, saved from further contamination, was rebatched in a fresh cask, and the widow's taps flowed again with triumph. And so, beneath the frost of a new winter, the widow's alehouse stood resilient, its barrels sealed by honesty, its trust reforged through forgiveness, and its heart warmed by the gentle wisdom of Miss Jane Marple, who knew that even the strongest oak might bend when the winds of human frailty blew too. Harshly. Chapter 5. A Toast to New Beginnings. A week had passed since the revelation in the cellar, since George Fletcher's trembling confession amid the oak barrels and the somber promise of apprenticeship elsewhere. In that time the widow's alehouse had seen more business than ever, as villagers, farmers, and travelers alike flocked to sample the restored spring brew and offer their support to Mrs. Hawkins. Even the Crown Inn's patrons crossed the square, tipping their hats in respectful homage to St. Mary Mead's indomitable brewer. On a crisp Wednesday morning, Miss Marple arrived at the alehouse just after the moon had set, its crescents still pale in the western sky. Smoke spiraled from the chimney, and the lanterns inside burned with a golden glow, promising warmth against the lingering chill. With her knitting basket held at her side, she stepped through the low-arched doorway to find Mrs. Hawkins already at the bar, polishing the brass taps until they gleamed like spun gold. "Good morning, Lucy," Miss Marple greeted softly, drawing her shawl a little tighter. "You look bright-eyed today." Mrs. Hawkins returned her smile, though a faint weariness lingered beneath her eyes. "I slept well for the first time in ages, Jane, knowing the ale is safe, and George on his way to learn anew has lifted my spirits tremendously." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And how fares the new apprentice?" "Samuel," Mrs. Hawkins clarified, "has taken on many more duties. He's become quite the cooper's helper himself, tightening hoops and inspecting bungs with a confidence he lacked before." She patted the polished counter. I'm relieved to be free of any more secrets lurking beneath the casks." Miss Marple drew up a stool and settled before the bar. "A clear conscience and a clear cellar, that is a fine foundation for any business." She paused, glancing at the row of brass taps. "I have come to propose a small celebration to honor the new chapter for this alehouse and its people." "Celebration?" Mrs. Hawkins's shoulders lifted in surprise and delight. "You do not need to spend your time on such matters, Jane." "I insist," Miss Marple answered, offering a conspiratorial smile. "Let us invite the vicar, Lady Everard, the station-master, perhaps even Mr. Barnes himself. We will hold a midwinter toast and impromptu gathering here, by candlelight, to show that the widow's alehouse remains the heart of St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Hawkins considered, her eyes brightening at the thought. "Yes, a winter's ale tasting, with mulled cider alongside the spring brew music by the children's choir, in the corner David Fletcher pipe on his fiddle." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked as she nodded. "Precisely. An event to remind everyone of the bonds we share, hardy enough to weather any storm." That afternoon, invitation cards were distributed by the village post, each adorned with a simple image of a frothing tankard and a sprig of holly. By evening, replies came fluttering back. The vicar and Mrs. Campion would attend. Lady Everard promised to arrive by carriage. Even Mr. Barnes conceded he would be present, with a modest gift of rare hops from Tunbridge. Samuel placed cedar boughs in the taproom's windows, and Mrs. Hawkins lit candles in every nook, their flames dancing upon the row of wooden pewter. Mugs perched on a shelf. On the appointed night, Miss Marple arrived in her best traveling cloak, its deep burgundy hue a festive contrast to the pale winter landscape. She found the taproom already alive with chatter and laughter. Tablesware, draped in green cloth, laden with slices of plum pudding. The windows gleamed with candlelight, and sprigs of mistletoe hung from the ceiling beams. At the far end, a group of village children huddled beneath lanterns, their breath puffing in excited clouds as they tuned their voices for a selection of seasonal carols. David Fletcher Pipe, newly apprenticed under a traveling musician, sat poised on a stool, his fiddle at the ready. Mrs. Hawkins, radiant in a deep green dress and pearls, hurried forward to greet Miss Marple. "I cannot thank you enough for this. Joy, Jane. It feels as though the alehouse has rediscovered its soul." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. "It is your soul, Lucy, and the generosity of this community that made it so. Now, let us begin." She moved to the small dais at the head of the room, lifted her teacup of mulled cider, and tapped the rim lightly with a spoon. Silence fell, and Mrs. Campion, seated beside the vicar, raised her own glass in acknowledgment. Mr. Barnes stood, a little apart, his expression earnest, a small packet of hops tucked under his arm. Lady Everard, gracious in a velvet cloak, rose from her seat, the carriage horse's faint whinny audible beyond the frosted window. Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried clearly across the taproom. "Friends of St. Mary Mead, I thank you for coming. Tonight we gather not only to sample Mrs. Hawkins's excellent brews, but to celebrate the spirit of unity and forgiveness that keeps our village strong. To Mrs. Hawkins for her steadfast courage, to Samuel and George who learn and grow, to all of you for your support and kindness, I propose a toast. May this widow's alehouse remain a haven of fellowship and cheer for many winters to come. A ripple of applause followed, and the glasses clinked in harmony. Mr. Barnes stepped forward, his gift of golden hops in hand. I, too, wish to add my thanks to Mrs. Hawkins for keeping our bellies warm and our hearts warm as well. These hops are for your next batch. May they lend extra sparkle. Mrs. Hawkins accepted the gift with a tearful smile. Thank you, thank you. Mr. Barnes, I will honor your kindness. The children's choir began softly, voices pure, as they sang Silent Night and Hark! The herald angels sing. David Fletcher Pipe's fiddle wove gentle harmony, while villagers, once strangers to each other's burdens, joined in, their voices rising amid the glowing lanterns. Miss Marple wandered the room, exchanging kind words with each guest. She paused by the hearth where Mrs. Campion sat, handing her a small mug of cider. Ellen, you look well tonight. Mrs. Campion sipped and nodded. I do, thanks to you and Lucy. I almost lost faith in simple joys, but now— She smiled as she gazed across the tap-room, where laughter and music filled every corner. Now I remember why I love this place. Further along, the vicar squeezed Miss Marple's hand. We all needed this gathering, Jane. You have given us much more than ale. You have refreshed our spirits. Miss Marple returned his squeeze. Nothing is more sustaining than fellowship, dear sir. In the center of the room, George Fletcher stood with his tutor from Tunbridge, his cheeks flushed with pride as he demonstrated his newly learned cooper's technique on a miniature barrel crafted for the occasion. Samuel, beside him, raised a tankard of ale in salute, his face bright with the promise of the future Dot as the carol concluded. Miss Marple climbed once more to the dais, lifting her glass one final time. To St. Mary Mead, its people, its kindness, its ale, and to the widow's alehouse, which stands as proof that truth, forgiveness, and a good brew can heal any wound. The room erupted in applause and exultant toasts. Mrs. Hawkins clasped Miss Marple's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. In that moment, as candlelight flickered upon the oak beams and laughter rang through the rafters, Miss Marple felt the beating heart of the village strong and sure. When the last guest departed, leaving only embers in the hearth and the sweet scent of hops lingering in the air, Mrs. Hawkins and Samuel set down the final mugs. Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair by the fire, her knitting needles finally still. Your plan was perfect, Jane. Mrs. Hawkins sighed, resting a hand on the pewter arm of the chair. You've made this alehouse a true home again. Miss Marple smiled contentedly. It was here all along, Lucy. It only needed a moment to remember itself. She lifted her head to the darkened rafters. And if ever the shadows gather again, we will face them together, with honesty, friendship, and a well-poured pint. Outside, the snow began to fall lightly, dusting the rooftops of St. Mary Mead in quiet white. Within the widow's alehouse, warmth remained undimmed, a testament to the enduring power of community and the gentle wisdom of one small woman, with a heart as generous as her smiles, and knitting needles ever ready for the next stitch in the fabric of village life. Chapter 6. The Secrets. Beneath the taproom floor a fortnight had passed since the midwinter celebration, and life at the widow's alehouse settled into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning Mrs. Hawkins lit the cast-iron stove before dawn, coaxing warmth into every corner of the taproom. Samuel polished the brass taps and scrubbed the flagstones until they gleamed, while George Fletcher, returning from his apprenticeship in Tunbridge, apprenticed anew this time under Mrs. Hawkins's watchful eye to refine his cooper's craft. Miss Marple, meanwhile, called in often, her knitting basket in hand, to enjoy a quiet cup of cider and listen to the gentle hum of conversation. Yet beneath the renewed cheer lay faint undercurrents, a restless customer who lingered too long. Over every draught, staff whispers of strange clinks echoing from the taproom floorboards late at night, and the unsettled sensation in Mrs. Hawkins's bones that someone watched her from the shadows beyond the windows. It was as though, having weathered 2 betrayals of trust, the alehouse still harbored hidden corners where unease festered. On a chilly Thursday morning, Miss Marple arrived to find Mrs. Hawkins standing behind the bar with a furrowed brow. "Good morning, Jane," she said hesitantly. "I'm glad you're here. Something odd occurred last night." Miss Marple settled onto her usual stool. "What troubles you, Lucy?" Mrs. Hawkins picked up a linen rag and folded it absently. "I heard a clatter from beneath the floorboards, right where we keep the reserve casks. Thought it might be rats, so I fetched the lantern and a broom. But when I lifted the boards, I found nothing, only the echo of dripping water." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "Dripping water, you say? But you heard metal striking. Wood as well?" "Yes," Mrs. Hawkins replied, "like a small hammer tapping. I thought perhaps George was practicing his repair work after hours, but his footsteps were quiet, and I would have seen his lantern's glow." Samuel approached, wiping his hands. "I heard nothing, Mrs. Hawkins, but I did find a damp patch beneath the floor this morning. I cleaned it, though it smelled faintly of the spring ale." Miss Marple rose and peered at the floorboards behind the bar. "Let us see." She knelt and rapped her knuckles on floorboard 3, the one nearest the cask store. A hollow note answered. With the alehouse quiet, she pried up the board gently, revealing a narrow cavity filled with aged dust, cobwebs, and at the back a small copper tap cap. Its spigot snapped off. "Ah," said Miss Marple, examining the fragment. "This is from our barrel taps barrel 14s we replaced last week. Someone has removed the cap and hidden it here." Mrs. Hawkins gasped. "But why? And who would know where to find it?" Miss Marple extracted the piece and handed it to Samuel. "Keep this aside. I suspect our saboteur is testing the taps, either to weaken them or to cause a leak when the ale is busy and dark. A broken tap cap would send ale gushing onto the floor, disrupting business and undermining confidence." Mrs. Hawkins clasped her hands. "You think someone intends further mischief?" Miss Marple rose. "I do, and given the recent history, we must act quickly. Such a leak could flood the cask store, spoil your entire spring brew, and force you to close for repairs." At that moment the door jingled, and Mr. Barnes entered, wrapping his scarf about his neck. He paused, noticing the lifted floorboard. "Good morning, ladies. I trust I'm not intruding?" Mrs. Hawkins managed a tight smile. "Not at all, Mr. Barnes. We were merely inspecting a loose board." She moved to replace it. "Samuel, bring more nails." Barnes eyed the copper fragment in Samuel's hand. "What's that?" Miss Marple stepped forward. A piece of barrel fittings discovered hidden beneath the floor. "It appears someone has been tampering with your tap caps, Mr. Barnes." He shrugged, face pale. "I haven't meddled here, I assure you. Competition has been stiff, though." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "I only seek fair trade, nothing more." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, but someone else might not be so scrupulous." She offered Barnes a cup of cider. "Please sit and tell us if you noticed anything unusual these past days." Barnes accepted the drink and waxed nervous. "No, truly. I've tended to the Crown, N's new ale pump, and been away each night. I even slept at home these past 2 weeks." Samuel cleared his throat. "You were spotted near the rear alley last night, though, about midnight." Barnes froze. "That was to fetch a spare barrel key I'd forgotten. I meant no harm. I returned it immediately." Mrs. Hawkins frowned. "At midnight, with ale flowing and casks sleeping? It seems an odd time for a simple errand." Miss Marple gave Barnes a gentle, knowing look. "Indeed, I think we shall. Keep closer watch tonight. If you truly have no part in this, you may wish to assist us." Barnes said. That evening, after the last customer had gone and the taproom lay hushed, Miss Marple, Mrs. Hawkins, Samuel, and a reluctant Mr. Barnes gathered behind the bar. A single lantern cast long shadows across the floorboards. Samuel handed Miss Marple. "A coil of thin wire and a small hook dot," Miss Marple explained. "We suspect the saboteur returns after closing to loosen tap caps or weep acid into the ale, much as before. Tonight we shall trap them by rigging the tap in 4 ways. A wire to ring a bell when disturbed, a dash of harmless dye to color any ale they taste, a small vial of pepper dust to choke them, and wrapped around this barrel spigot." She held up the remaining copper cap, "a note declaring we will prosecute any tampering. The culprit will reveal themselves soon enough." They worked swiftly, the wire attached to a barely audible bell, the dye hidden in a pinprick hole, the pepper dust taped inside the cap, and the warning note threaded beneath the last floorboard above the cavity. Then they retreated upstairs, leaving Barnes to watch the stairs while Miss Marple concealed herself in the loft once more. Minutes later, muffled footsteps creaked across the bar floor. Samuel stifled a gasp. The saboteur knelt at the south tap, loosened the cap, and removed it with deft fingers. A soft ring sounded as the wire slipped free, and the bell beneath the floor tinkled once. The saboteur paused, sniffed the ale, and licked the spigot, immediately gagging as pepper burst across their tongue. A faint hiss accompanied a glowing orange stain in the pool beneath, where the harmless dye-seeped dot. Miss Marple slipped down the ladder into the cellar, snatching the saboteur's hand as they staggered toward the trapdoor. "Caught at last," she exclaimed, pulling off the hood to reveal George Fletcher. Tears streaming down his cheeks, Mrs. Hawkins, and Samuel hurried down to find George blinking at the stained ale and peppered spigot, shame in his eyes. Barnes did not appear. Perhaps he stood guard upstairs or fled in fright. Miss Marple regarded George with quiet understanding. "Why, George, after all you have endured?" George dropped to his knees. I thought if I sabotaged the taps, business would slow here, and more customers would return to the Crown Inn. I never meant to harm the ale itself, only the reputation." Mrs. Hawkins knelt beside him. "You are forgiven, George, but You must promise never to make such a mistake again." Samuel added, "We trusted you, George. Please don't let us down again." George raised tear-glazed eyes. "I promise. I will serve honorably, not by sabotage." "I'm so sorry." Miss Marple stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Then let us restore the taps and floorboard and call this matter closed. You will help me replace that copper cap tomorrow properly with your own hands." George nodded vigorously, relief mingling with contrition. They worked together, sealing the tap anew and restoring the board above. The final note lay beneath the wood, unseen until needed at dawn. Mrs. Hawkins opened the taproom and poured the first draught from barrel 14. The ale flowed clear and crisp, its sweetness untainted. The bell above the door jingled as the first customers arrived, and laughter filled the room once more. Miss Marple, perched by the hearth with her knitting, watched George deliver fresh mugs with steady hands. Samuel polished the taps with a proud smile, and Mrs. Hawkins poured generous portions of mulled cider for the early RICRS. As the village awoke, the widow's alehouse stood secure, its floors untroubled, its casks untouched, and its community reminded that trust once shaken may be rebuilt by vigilance, forgiveness, and the keen insight of one small lady who knew that even the quietest taproom held secrets beneath its boards. Chapter 7. Whispers on the winter air. The first thaw of late February crept slowly across St. Mary Mead, coaxing tender shoots from the frozen earth and transforming puddles of melting snow into tiny mirror pools beneath the hedges. In the widow's alehouse, the lingering breath of winter still warmed cheeks and bellies, but an undercurrent of fresh hope now animated every corner. Mrs. Hawkins had replaced the heavy winter drapes with lighter curtains of pale linen, embroidered with hops in budding green thread. Samuel had dusted the tomes in the small reading nook and replaced the firewood with flower-scented logs that smoldered gently, lending a soft glow to the taproom's oak beams. Miss Marple arrived just before midday, her woolen shawl folded neatly over her arm. Pushing open the door, she was greeted by the familiar scent of malt, still tempered by the bright tang of lemon-dill cider from the new spring batch. George Fletcher, newly returned from Tunbridge and re-championed by Mrs. Hawkins, stood behind the bar with a confident smile as he tapped the daily barrel. His hands moved with the surety of a man who had learned humility and skill alike. "Good day, Miss Marple," George called, setting a brass mug of ale before her. "I trust you enjoy the new spring stout?" Miss Marple lifted the mug to her lips, savoring its rich, earthy sweetness tinged with the faintest whisper of citrus. "Delightful, George. A testament to your hard-won craft." She patted his shoulder. "You've done well." George bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. I've much to atone for, but my apprenticeship here under Mrs. Hawkins has taught me more than I dreamed." At a corner table, Mrs. Hawkins exchanged greetings with a pair of customers, Reverend Greaves, clutching his woolen muffler, and Lady Everard, whose velvet cloak still shimmered despite the warmth within. Both rose to acknowledge Miss Marple's entrance, their faces brightening. "I trust the alehouse finds you both well?" Miss Marple asked as she rose from her stool and joined them. "Excellent," Lady Everard replied. "I brought buttered scones for the bake sale next door at the parish hall, but I paused for a nip of Mrs. Hawkins's best." She glanced at the bar. "You have truly transformed your brew since last winter." Reverend Greaves nodded. "Indeed, Lucy's spring stout rivals any I've tasted in Tunbridge, and the taproom's warmth draws more travelers than the Crown Inn these days." Mrs. Hawkins returned, bearing a tray of steaming mugs and scones dusted with sugar. "Thank you both for your kind words. Tonight we shall hold the Lent supper here, before the service, to raise funds for the orphanage. I hope the ale lends cheer to the occasion." Miss Marple's eyes lit with approval. "A splendid idea. Your generosity now extends beyond ale and repair." She turned to the Reverend. "Will you lead the prayers, sir?" "Of course, Miss Marple," he replied, bowing. "It shall be my privilege." The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm of idly perused books, friendly chatter, and strategically placed flower vases catching the last snowmalt light through the windows. Miss Marple found a few moments to speak privately with Samuel, who was busy polishing the silver tap handles until they gleamed like new. "Samuel," she said in a low voice, "I have heard that the station master's daughter, Milly, has asked you to teach her about brewing for her school project. Have you considered that?" Samuel glanced up, cheeks coloring. "Yes, ma'am. She's eager to learn the basics, yeast, temperature control, that sort of thing. I thought a single lesson might be enough." Miss Marple smiled. "Our craft flourishes when knowledge is shared. Perhaps you could invite Milly to observe the mashed tun this afternoon. It would honor our community's future brewers." He nodded, relieved and gratified. "I shall do so." As the third bell of afternoon sounded from the church steeple, the tavern door opened to admit Milly Marsh, her auburn hair escaping a navy bonnet, cheeks rosy, and eyes bright with anticipation. She curtsied to Mrs. Hawkins and Miss Marple, then hurried to Samuel's side. "Samuel, I brought my notebook," she exclaimed. "I'm ready to learn." Samuel guided her to the brewery door. "Follow me, Milly. Remember, the mash process is delicate too warm, and the yeast will not ferment properly." An hour later, Miss Marple found Mrs. Hawkins rearranging chairs for the evening's Lent supper, a simple affair of vegetable broth, bread bowls, and the widow's stout to accompany it. Lady Everard and the Reverend helped tie cloth napkins around silverware. The taproom's long central table gleamed under the lantern light, set with church pewter and wildflower sprigs. Milly and Samuel returned, cheeks flushed with excitement. "It was fascinating, Miss Marple," Milly said, clutching her notebook. "I never knew brewing was so scientific." Miss Marple beamed. "Knowledge shared is knowledge strengthened." "Thank you, Milly, and you, Samuel." She turned to Mrs. Hawkins. "All is in readiness, I believe." Mrs. Hawkins dusted her hands on her apron. "Yes, the trays of bread bowls await the broth, and the lentil pot is simmering gently in the kitchen. Soon the villagers will gather." As dusk settled, the taproom filled with parishioners streaming in from neighboring homes. They greeted one another with warmth, farmers in woolen caps bowing to school teachers, shopkeepers smiling at their customers. The tremor of winter's hush had faded, replaced by the stable hum of a community at peace. Reverend Greaves stood at the head of the table. "Friends, let us bow our heads in prayer." His voice rang clear, words of thanksgiving for nourishment, fellowship, and the grace that binds them. When he finished, plates were passed, bowls filled, and spoons dipped into steaming broth. The widow's spring stout, now on cask, was drawn by Samuel and poured in small mugs, the amber liquid glowing in the lantern light. Lady Everard tapped her mug gently. To the widow's alehouse, may its warmth, generosity, and wisdom continue to nourish all who enter. A chorus of hear, hear. The first ladleful of soup was consumed, drawing murmurs of appreciation for its savory richness. Conversation wove through the room. Talk of the upcoming planting season, the school's spring concert, and the county fair projected to return in June. Mrs. Hawkins, seated beside Miss Marple, wiped a tear from her eye. This is all I ever hoped for, a place where everyone finds welcome. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. You have created more than an alehouse, Lucy. You have built a hearth for every soul in this village. When the last ladle was served and the pewter mugs set aside, Reverend Greaves offered a closing blessing, and the gathering dispersed. Into the starlit night, Mrs. Hawkins walked her few stragglers to the door, bidding them good evening. Beyond the threshold lay the frozen square, but the glow from within spilled out like a hearth's invitation. Miss Marple lingered in the taproom, embracing each beam and shadow in a silent gratitude. She moved to the bar and ran her hand along its polished edge. Here so much had happened, betrayals unearthed, trust rebuilt, community strengthened, and still the oak stood firm. George Fletcher appeared, clearing mugs from the last table. He paused to meet her gaze. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for believing in me." She smiled, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Your promise to serve honorably has given strength to us all, George. You have paid your debt many times over." Outside, the wind whispered through the budding hedges, carrying the faint promise of spring's full bloom. Within the widow's alehouse, laughter still echoed, and in that warmth, Miss Marple sensed that the quiet mysteries of the village of human frailty and resilience had found their perfect resolution, at least until the next frost, or the next whisper on the winter air. Chapter 8. The Missing Silver. Tankerderley March arrived in St. Mary Mead like a promise of renewal. Pale crocuses dotted the thawing lawns, and the air carried the mingled scents of damp earth and budding willow. Yet for all the promise of spring, a new chill had settled upon the widow's alehouse, this time not of frost, but of bewilderment. Miss Marple arrived at mid-morning, to find Mrs. Hawkins standing behind the bar, white-faced and clutching a folded piece of paper. George Fletcher, now confident in his duties, polished the brass tap handles with particular care, casting anxious glances toward the hearth. Samuel stood behind him, clearing mugs more briskly than usual. The taproom, recently brimming with the warm laughter of Lent suppers and midwinter celebrations, felt hushed as though awaiting some untoward revelation. "Lucy, my dear," Miss Marple called gently, stepping inside. "Whatever troubles you so early?" Mrs. Hawkins unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. "It's come this morning slipped." Between the pewter mugs on the shelf, she glanced up, eyes haunted. "A note addressed to me, threatening unless I return what I have borrowed." Miss Marple took the note and read aloud. "Return the silver tankard to Lady Everard by sunset or face the consequences." Miss Marple lifted her eyebrows. "Silver tankard? You have no tankard of that description here." She turned to George. "Do you recall moving any such vessel?" George shook his head, face pale. Only the pewter ones. No silver tankards in our stock. Samuel peered behind the bar. Unless it refers to Lady Everard's heirloom jug, the one she lent you for the midwinter toast? Mrs. Hawkins's hand flew to her heart. Oh, yes, her family's silver. Tankard. She entrusted it to me for the celebration. I returned it afterward, or thought I did. Perhaps it never came back. Miss Marple nodded. Then the case is clear. Someone has taken Lady Everard's tankard, hoping to extort you before evidence surfaces. But who had access during the festivities and afterward? She surveyed the tap-room, the floorboards scuffed by countless steps, the shelf where the tankard once gleamed, and the small side table where Lady Everard had presided. She turned to Samuel. Who helped you clear the tables after the Lent supper? Samuel counted on his fingers. Mrs. Campion, Mr. Barnes, and Miss Marsh stayed behind to help, along with Lady Everard and a few of the choir girls. Miss Marple smiled sagely. A small circle, then. Let us retrace their movements. She beckoned Mrs. Hawkins and Samuel to join her. First, Mrs. Campion. Did she linger near the tankard after the evening ended? Mrs. Hawkins considered. Yes, she admired it greatly, said it reminded her of the church silver at St. Peter's. Miss Marple made a note. Second, Mr. Barnes. He carried a crate to his carriage filled with hops as a gift, he said. He might have used it to conceal a small jug. George frowned. He has no use for another container, but he did spin a story about collecting firewood from the back alley. Miss Marple nodded. Third, Miss Marsh. She left early to catch the 5:30 train, clutching her school books. Did she carry anything else? Samuel hesitated. Her satchel bulged oddly. I saw her adjust it near the door, as though settling. Something inside. Mrs. Hawkins's eyes widened. Miss Marsh's office is near the alehouse. She could have retrieved the tankard later. Miss Marple tapped her chin. And finally, Lady Everard herself. She was gracious in her thanks, then left with the tankard held close under her cloak. Did anyone see it afterward? Mrs. Hawkins shook her head. The next morning I found her return for sugar, but she didn't come inside. She left the note under the door. Miss Marple folded the paper thoughtfully. We must question each suspect, but first let us confirm that Lady Everard indeed returned her tankard, as she believed. I will accompany you to her cottage this morning. A brisk walk through the dew-sprinkled square brought them to Lady Everard's rose-scented gate. The great windows of Willow House gleamed in the sun as they rang the bell. Lady Everard answered, her face lined with concern. Lucy, what troubles you now? She asked, noting Mrs. Hawkins's pallor. The tankard, my lady, Mrs. Hawkins sighed. I received a threat concerning it. I believed I returned it to you. Did it not arrive safely? Lady Everard's brow furrowed. I was certain I brought it home after the feast, but let us see. She led them to the drawing-room, where a silver tea service shone on a mahogany sideboard. Yet the tankard, a tall, slender vessel, embossed with the Everard crest, was nowhere to be seen. Lady Everard gasped. It is gone. Miss Marple took a small silver teaspoon from the tray. By process of elimination, it must have remained on your person until you reached here, then slipped from your cloak or pocket. Perhaps someone intercepted you on the steps or at the gate. Mrs. Hawkins sank into an armchair. But I found the note this morning. Someone must hold it still and want it back. Miss Marple offered her hand. Come, let us return to the alehouse. I have an idea how to draw our culprit into the open." Back at the taproom, the atmosphere had turned tense. George stood behind the bar, arms folded, while Samuel watched the door. Miss Marple moved to the shelf where the tankard had lived, now empty except for its plaque. "I propose a little enticement," she said quietly. She returned to her coat and produced a small folded note of her own. "Tonight at closing time, the tankard will be returned placed at its original spot, upon the shelf. Those who borrowed or coveted it shall find it glinting under the lantern's glow. Until then, all doors shall remain unlocked, and no one may leave." She pinned the note to the bar with a pewter spoon. "Rest assured our culprit cannot resist such a promise. Now we wait." When evening fell and the last customers departed, Miss Marple, Mrs. Hawkins, Samuel, and Mr. Barnes concealed themselves behind the bar. The lanterns were dimmed to a single lamp above the empty shelf, where Miss Marple had placed a polished brass tankard she had borrowed from her own collection, its silhouette nearly identical to Lady Everard's. Minutes later, soft footsteps approached. A slender figure crept from the corner, gloved hands outstretched. It paused under the lamp, breath visible in the cold gloom. Samuel stifled a gasp as the figure reached forward and lifted the tankard dot. Miss Marple sprang from her hiding place. "Got you." The figure spun, revealing Mrs. Campion, her rosary beads slipping through trembling fingers. "Helen, why?" Mrs. Campion's eyes shone with tears. "I borrowed it only to glimpse its beauty by lamplight. I meant to return it, but when I saw the note, I panicked. I thought if I held it longer, I could arrange for a quiet return, but now I'm trapped." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Helen, your love of beauty led you astray, but no harm was intended. The real culprit is not here." She stepped forward. "Hand over the tankard, please." Mrs. Campion set it on the bar, relief flooding her features. Miss Marple took it and turned to Mr. Barnes. "Mr. Barnes, will you join me in retrieving this piece for Lady Everard?" Barnes nodded, stepping forward. Miss Marple and Barnes crossed to the door and emerged into the moonlit square. They carried the tankard carefully back to Willow House Dot the next morning. Lady Everard arrived at the alehouse to retrieve her treasured vessel. It gleamed on the back bar under the soft morning light. Mrs. Hawkins greeted her with a small tin of lavender, tea, and Miss Marple's calm smile. "Your tankard," Mrs. Hawkins said, bowing slightly, "returned before closing as promised." Lady Everard's relief was profound. She took the vessel and turned to Miss Marple. "Thank you, Jane, for unraveling this gentle mystery and for sparing the good name of Mrs. Campion." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes the most delicate secrets lie in beauty's reflection. Now that the tankard is home, may it stand as a reminder that As Lady Everard departed with her heirloom returned, Mrs. Hawkins exhaled. I feared the alehouse would never feel safe again. Miss Marple draped an arm around her friend. "Trust, once restored, shines more brightly, and in this tavern's warmth our village will find both comfort and candor." Outside, the sun warmed the square, dispelling the last whisper of winter's chill. Within the widow's alehouse, life resumed its gentle flow. Orderly and honest, its secrets once more laid open to the light, and its heart secure under the watchful eye of Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 9. The disappearance of the widow's recipe late. March dawned in St. Mary Mead, with a sky of soft pearl and a promise of full spring. But in the widow's alehouse a new chill had taken root. Mrs. Hawkins, her spirits usually buoyed by the season's turn, hurried about the taproom in a state of growing alarm. The treasured leather-bound notebook in which she recorded every ingredient, every temperature, every timing of her celebrated ales her secret recipe book had vanished from its usual resting place on the high shelf beside the bar. Miss Marple arrived just before noon to find Mrs. Hawkins standing on a stool, peering anxiously into empty brackets on the shelf. Samuel hovered below, ready to catch her if she slipped, while George Fletcher wiped his hands on a cloth and watched the scene with concern. "I don't understand, Jane," Mrs. Hawkins said, sliding from the stool and smoothing her apron. "I placed the book here last night after inventory, and this morning it's gone. The shelf is undisturbed otherwise. No footprints on the ladder, no sign of forced entry. Yet the book is simply gone." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the empty brackets and the narrow ledge beneath. "Did you close up as usual, Lucy? Lock the bar doors, secure the cellar access?" "I did," Mrs. Hawkins replied. "I turned the key in the front door, set the little bolt on the kitchen hatch, and even checked the back alley window before bed. All was secure." Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "I was here late, helping Mrs. Hawkins check spring stocks. I left at 9, locking the side door behind me. No one else was in the taproom afterward." Miss Marple tapped a finger on her chin. "Then our culprit either has a key or knew a way to slip indoors unseen. And someone who knew the book's value and its hiding place." She turned to George. "George, have you had any reason to be near that shelf?" George shook his head emphatically. "No, ma'am. I've been busy in the cooperage and cellar. I wouldn't be near your recipe book." Miss Marple studied the room. The alehouse had been the scene of many small crimes, stolen ales, vanished tankards. But the theft of a recipe book was more personal. It threatened the very heart of Mrs. Hawkins's livelihood. We must consider motive. Who would watch your recipes? A rival brewer, perhaps, or someone in the village hoping to replicate your success? Or someone closer to home, curious about your secrets? Mrs. Hawkins shuddered. Every one of our little circle had access last night. The vicar and Mrs. Campion for supper, Lady Everard for her counsel. Mr. Barnes delivered hops. Even Miss Marsh called to retrieve a forgotten satchel. Any of them could have seen the book. Miss Marple nodded. "Let us question each in turn. But first, shall we search for hidden compartments here? Sabotage is best concealed where trust is highest." She led Mrs. Hawkins and Samuel to the shelf and pressed along the woodwork. Beneath one bracket, a sliver of light gleamed. Miss Marple pried slightly, revealing a secret slot, a thin cavity behind the shelf. Unnoticeable unless one knew it was there. Samuel peered inside. "It's empty." Miss Marple retrieved a small trowel. "You see, Lucy, you never stored the book directly on the shelf, but slid it into this hidden slot for safekeeping. Whoever knew your method could extract it without disturbing the room." She tapped her temple. "Our thief is intimately familiar with this house." Double quotes. Mrs. Hawkins's hands trembled. "But who? I've trusted every soul here." Miss Marple smiled gently but firmly. "Then let us begin with those most familiar with your habits." She motioned Mrs. Hawkins to the bar. Prepare some warm cider. We shall invite our friends for a demonstration of how one stores such a book and watch, who reacts most keenly. By early afternoon, Miss Marple's invitation had gathered an expectant circle. Reverend Greaves, Mrs. Campion, Lady Everard, Mr. Barnes, and Miss Marsh. They clustered before the bar, their faces curious as Mrs. Hawkins produced a fresh leather-bound journal and held it aloft. "Friends," Mrs. Hawkins began, voice steady, "this is a replica of my recipe book. I keep my true notes hidden in a slider behind this very shelf," she demonstrated, sliding it into place. "Now, should I remove it, one needs only press this bracket," she mimed the motion, "and draw it free." Miss Marple watched each face. Reverend Greaves inclined his head thoughtfully. Mrs. Campion's brows knitted. Lady Everard's lips pursed in concentration. Mr. Barnes's gaze flickered, and Miss Marsh stared at the shelf, perplexity flashing in her eyes. As Mrs. Hawkins mind replacing the journal. Miss Marple caught Lady Everard's breath hitch, just the faintest intake that betrayed recognition. She leaned forward, voice quiet. "Lady Everard, did you ever inspect that shelf closely?" Lady Everard's cheeks flushed. She stammered, I admired the journals from afar, but I never handled them. Forgive me if I seemed too focused." Miss Marple allowed a sympathetic nod. "Of course, it is human to observe what one admires. But admiring is not the same as extracting." She turned to Mr. Barnes. "Mr. Barnes, you delivered hops through that side door last night. Did you notice the shelf's bracket?" Barnes's face paled. I knocked briefly, but found the door locked. I did not enter the taproom proper." Samuel glanced at Miss Marsh. "Miss Marsh, you called at closing for your satchel. Did you perchance bump the bracket in your haste?" Miss Marsh swallowed. I may have glanced at the shelf as I waited for the door to open, but I did not touch anything." Mrs. Campion stepped forward, voice soft. "May I speak freely? I suspected my niece Milly of borrowing your book. I saw her note passed, too. Another girl, after the celebration, asking for brewing tips. I thought she needed guidance for her project, so I to safeguard the book from prying children. She drew a small shawl around her shoulders. I did not steal it, but I feared leaving it where she might glimpse it." Miss Marple's gaze softened on Mrs. Campion. "Fear can lead us to side-slip from honesty. But this theft was more. Deliberate someone took it from its hidden place." She looked around the circle. "There remains one person most familiar with the shelf's secret." All eyes turned to Lady Everard, whose posture tensed. Miss Marple continued quietly, "A person who visited many times here, who appreciated Mrs. Hawkins's craft, and who admired the journal's binding, if only to imagine the secrets within." Lady Everard's serene mask slipped. She took a step toward Mrs. Hawkins. "Lucy, I borrowed your notebook after the Lent supper. I wished to review your notes on the herb infusions. You taught me much, but when I opened the slider, the book vanished from the bar. In my startled search, I slid it into my cloak and placed it in my desk at home, intending to return it at dawn. By morning, I feared you would suspect me, so I delayed." Mrs. Hawkins's eyes shone with a mixture of relief and tenderness. "Oh, my dear Evelyn, you need only have asked. My heart earned your trust." Lady Everard sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "I meant no harm. I respect your work above all, But I panicked. Miss Marple moved to console them both. Intentions matter less than trust. Now that your fear is laid to rest, we can restore the journal to its rightful place. She addressed the circle. Let this be a lesson. The closest friendships can falter on unspoken fears, but honesty at once returns the peace we cherish. That evening, as the alehouse glowed beneath a violet dusk, Mrs. Hawkins replaced her true recipe book in its secret slot. Lady Everard stood by her side offering comfort and apologies, while Miss Marple and the rest of the circle watched with gentle smiles. Samuel lit the lanterns, and George tested the taps of barrels 12, through aiding ensuring every cask was secure. Outside, the first nightingale of spring trilled from the hedgerows, and within the taproom the scent of malt, hops, and budding blossoms mingled in harmonious promise. Mrs. Hawkins raised a pewter mug of her new summer ale. To truth, friendship, and the widow's alehouse, she proclaimed. All joined in the toast, their voices mingling in laughter and relief. And as the village's gentle heart beat on, Miss Marple settled by the hearth, knitting needles at rest, content in the knowledge that once more the alehouse stood fortified by the simple power of honesty, and that even the deepest secrets, when revealed in trust, could lead to the richest of harvests. Chapter 10. Harvest Home and Harmony Restored. Late April. Sun burned away the last whispers of spring frost from the lanes of St. Mary Mead, and the air carried the heady promise of summer's bounty. The widow's alehouse, nestled at the square's corner beneath its linden trees, glowed with renewed confidence. Its windows flung open to the breeze, its garden bursting with hops and lavender, and its taproom thronged with villagers eager to partake in the season's final celebration. Miss Marple arrived just after breakfast, her straw hat trimmed with a single hop vine, and paused to take in the scene. Across the cobbles, Lily of the Valley and Primrose bordered Mrs. Lucas's milliner's shop. The church steeple behind the green glimmered. Golden sign and braided garlands of fresh hops stood as a testament to the resilience of friendship and truth. Inside, Mrs. Hawkins fluttered busily among the tables, tying ribbons to the chairs and placing small posies of fragrant herbs at each place. Samuel attended to the taps, ensuring the spring stout and new pale ale flowed smoothly. George Fletcher, now fully reinstated as head cooper, inspected a gleaming copper cask, destined for the Harvest Home festival that would crown the season's labors. Even Lady Everard had turned her carriage out in fine order to ferry guests from neighboring villages, while Reverend Greaves stood in a corner, quietly offering last-minute prayers for fair weather. Miss Marple dusted her knitting baskets, contents one half-finished shawl and a few stray needles, and exchanged warm greetings with each of them. At last she found Mrs. Hawkins by the bar, pouring a tumbler of lemon-dill cider from a crystal decanter. "Lucy," Miss Marple called, "softly, you look as though this day has sprung fully formed from your heart's desire." Mrs. Hawkins wiped her brow with a linen handkerchief. "I scarcely believe we have arrived at this moment, Jane. From sabotaged barrels to stolen tankards to vanished recipes, our alehouse has weathered storms I never imagined. Yet here we stand ready to celebrate Harvest Home." She raised her glass to our village's harvest, on field and in cask. Clink went Miss Marple's glass, to the widow's alehouse, which has become the hearth of St. Mary Mead. By mid-morning the taproom doors stood wide, and guests arrived under a canopy of hop vines woven overhead. Tables stretched in long rows, laden with sandwiches of fresh chives and cucumber, bowls of nettle soup, and platters of baked apples, drizzled with honey offerings from the village's gardens and orchards. At the far end, 2 barrels flanked a small dais, one of the spring stout that had won hearts, the other of the pale ale infused with elderflower. Lady Everard took her place on the dais, her velvet cloak now set aside for a linen coat embroidered with hop motifs. She tapped a silver goblet, her family's heirloom tankard, now safely returned and polished to a mirror shine, and the gentle clamor of voices fell to a hush. "Friends," she began, voice bright, "we gather today not only to feast upon our labors, but to honor the bonds that bind us, honesty, forgiveness, and community. Let us raise our glasses to Mrs. Hawkins, who dreamed this alehouse into being, to Samuel and George, whose dedication made it thrive, to each one of you whose trust rejuvenated this hall, and to the seasons ahead, may they be ever so kind." Applause rippled through the crowd, and Lady Everard led the first draught, a head of creamy foam glinting in the sunlight. One by one, the villagers followed, their mugs echoing the toast with cheerful resonance as the feast commenced. Miss Marple slipped away to inspect the garden behind the alehouse, where binds of hops climbed trellises and lavender spilled from beds in tidy rows. There she found Reverend Greaves and Mrs. Campion comparing notes on the upcoming choir recital. "Jane," the vicar exclaimed, "I see you've come for your second helping of nettle soup." Miss Marple grinned. "And to see if the garden thrives as well as the taproom." Mrs. Campion nodded. "It does, thanks to George's careful tending and Samuel's irrigation system. Even the lemon balm is abundant sufficient for many jugs. Of your favorite lemonade," Reverend Greaves chuckled. "We will need every sprig. The choir performs under these trees at twilight." Miss Marple's gaze swept the bower. "It seems every strand of this village's tapestry has been rewoven stronger. For its phrase," she paused, "Lucy asked me to lead a final unveiling this afternoon. Shall we return for that?" They agreed, and together the 3 made their way back past the taproom's open windows, where laughter and song drifted on the breeze. At 2:00, an expectant crowd gathered on the village green, benches arrayed beneath the alehouses. Facade. Mrs. Hawkins stood before a large wooden cask draped in a green cloth, its brass tap gleaming like a beacon. On either side stood the veteran cooper's tools, Samuel's brewing tables, and Lady Everard's silver tankard, perched upon a velvet cushion. Miss Marple stepped forward, raising her voice so all could hear. "Friends of St. Mary Mead, you have lived through many trials with our alehouse, thefts, sabotage, misapprehensions. But each trial has taught us the true recipe for harmony is not found on paper, but in our shared compassion, our willingness to forgive, and our faith in one another. Today, Lucy reveals the final secret she found too precious to remain hidden." At her nod, Mrs. Hawkins drew back the cloth, revealing the cask's new plaque, "Harvest Home Ale, a recipe of community." Underneath, engraved in flowing script, the words, "For every hand that lends its skill, our hearts brew peace and goodwill." Gasps of delight rippled through the crowd as Samuel released the first trickle of bronze ale into Lady Everard's tankard. The silver goblet brimmed, and Mrs. Hawkins poured for each in turn, Samuel and George distributing mugs. With triumphant smiles, Mrs. Hawkins raised her tankard. To every one of you, this cask embodies our shared efforts, from the fields to the barrels to the hearth. May its ale find you well, and may its spirit uplift us always. Miss Marple added her own toast. To St. Mary Mead, a village of honest hearts and steady hands. As the sun dipped low and twilight danced among the tree-tops, the choir assembled beneath the hop-laced archway. They began with all things bright and beautiful, their clear voices carrying across the green. Villagers joined in, hearts full, voices united in the spring air. Miss Marple watched from the alehouse steps, knitting needles still as she smiled at the scene. Mrs. Hawkins stood beside her, her arm linked with Miss Marple's, while Samuel and George shared a quiet nod of mutual pride. Lady Everard and Reverend Greaves held hands in the front pew, and the first stars began to glimmer overhead. In that moment, Miss Marple reflected upon the winding path that had brought them here, the cunning theft of barrels, the near ruin of reputations, the gentle unmasking of fears and follies. Each incident had tested the village's bonds, yet each had yielded a deeper strength. For it was not the ale alone that had made the widow's alehouse the heart of St. Mary Mead, but the human spirit, vulnerable, flawed, forgiving, and ultimately triumphant. As the final note of the choir echoed into silence, Miss Marple rose and addressed the assembly. May we always remember this day and the truth it celebrates, that when we stand together, guided by honesty and kindness, no mystery is too dark, no challenge too great. St. Mary Mead, you have proven that friendship and trust are the richest harvest of all. A cheer rose, soft at first, then swelling into a jubilant roar. Glasses clinked once more, and fireflies, woken by the alehouse's warmth, gathered in dancing arcs above the green. Under the thatched roof of the widow's alehouse, Miss Jane Marple settled into her favorite armchair by the hearth, her knitting, needles finely still. The gentle flicker of the fire cast its glow across the room, illuminating every happy face. Outside, the night air carried the faint scent of hops, lavender, and freshly tilled earth, an aroma of promise and continuation. And so concluded the story of the widow's alehouse, a tale of secrets unearthed and friendship reforged, of small deceptions and grand confessions, of sour casks saved by swift justice and cherished heirlooms reclaimed by gracious hearts. In St. Mary Mead the ale flows on, the casks stand true, and Miss Jane Marple, guardian of its gentlest mysteries, rests easy content in the knowledge that in a village built on trust